Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Urban Legends video. Well, I'm going to have this one produced for this particular series, and then I'm going to be off on my trip, so I won't have any more videos made for a couple of days now. But in the meantime, I highly recommend everybody to check out my past Urban Legends video and to also check out all of my videos associated with cryptids and monsters. Set them up as a playlist if you'd like. There's a bunch of good material to go over. So highly recommended to check out that stuff. And then again, with any of those videos that you see, if you have any personal experiences of what I'm talking about, then please post your comments, share them with everybody. It'll be interesting to find out what people have to say with regards to anything that I'm talking about on those videos. So again, I'll have some new ones coming up sometime next week. So thank you again for your continued suggestions. This particular Urban Legends video, it's not going to be as long as some of the past ones that I've done, but it's still some pretty interesting stuff, and it follows the theme associated with my last video, and that was of course when I was talking about that strange gentleman that came in to that Tokyo area, that man from Taured who came into that Tokyo airport and then was never seen again. It's following that similar theme, and what I'm talking about here has to do with the legend of David Lang. If anyone has heard of this particular legend, it's apparently one that's been around for a good while. We're talking at least anywhere from the late 1800s onwards. So definitely urban legend that has had a good history, and I'll explain everything associated with this urban legend, as well as apparently it's based off of a real account. And so not only is the legend of David Lang either real or potentially not real, but it of itself, it is based off of a real account. And all in all, it's up to you to decide whether anything that I'm about to present here is real, or if it truly is urban legend status, stuff that just is like a tall tale of sorts and just grew its own legs and went from there. And I'll give my own thoughts on what I think the legend of David Lang is, what kind of category it falls into. So what is the legend of David Lang? Well, it's a story, a tale that starts again in the late 1800s. You have to go back to 1880 to be exact, September 23rd, so it gets pretty specific, and the story goes like this. David Lang was a gentleman who was living in a place called Sumner County, Tennessee. I've also heard, when I was doing the research, I've also heard others mention that it was actually a place called Gallatin, Tennessee. Whatever the case is, this was a time period again in the late 1800s where there would not have been any kind of technology advance. We're talking an era associated with the dune buggy and the horse and the usual stuff associated with plantations and farmers. Nothing in terms of what we see today. And I'm mentioning this because it's key to realize how his disappearance could have happened when one tries to analyze it later on. So this is how the story goes. This guy, he was presumably this was sometime in the afternoon. There was no mention associated with the time period of that particular incident, but the way it happened was he was there in his home. He had his wife and his two children. They were apparently outside in the field. Maybe the wife was tending to the two children and David was doing some work in and around that area. And what had happened was he suddenly decided that he was going to cross over towards his field to try to get something apparently from the other side. The way the story goes is that the two children, by the way, were named George and Sarah. They were in the front yard area, and again his wife was in and around that area as well. Maybe they were playing, and some of the stories I read, the two children were playing in the front yard and the wife was in and around that area. He also, this guy David, apparently had his parents there as well in his home. His parents were named David and Emma, and they were also in and around that area too. So the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because there were a lot of witnesses for this particular incident. So there were horses that were close to his pasture, close to his field there. So David decided that for whatever reason he was going to tend to the horses. And right when this was happening, there was yet another set of witnesses coming around his location. Apparently it was a neighbor or a friend that was a judge. He went by the name Judge August Peck. So this was a guy that again was approaching that area. But he actually had a buggy, and it was a horse-drawn buggy, and inside that buggy was his own family. So yet again, more witnesses related to this incident. So David started again to walk across that pasture, and as he was walking, he saw his neighbor, that judge, again approaching. He decided to wave to him, and then this is what happened. As he waved to the judge, and this must have also caught the attention of his family, because at that point his wife and his children and then also his parents looked up. Maybe they didn't realize that this judge was coming around the corner as well, and then hearing David call to the judge, naturally it draws attention, and so they looked up at that exact moment, and this is what happened. They all saw in clear view, 100% unobstructed view, because this was a field, a regular field like you and I think of one as. In other words, it's low-level grass, no trees, just a large patch of 100% field, so a complete unobstructed view. And they saw him disappear right there in midair, like poof, he's gone. 100% gone as he was waving to the judge. Everybody saw this again in clear view, so one can only imagine how unsettling that particular instant was. There was somebody you knew, whether it was a husband to you, or whether it was a father, or whether it was, in the case of the parents, a son, or whether it was, in the case of the judge, a neighbor. There he was walking across the field, waving right towards you, and then he disappears right there in midair. Apparently the wife then screamed at what had happened, and everybody ran right to that spot where he was, but they did not find him at all. The first thought that they had was that he must have fallen through some kind of hole, which is a proper inclination. That's the most common idea. I would come up with that idea too. The first instinct is to run and see maybe there was a sinkhole. Maybe there was an unannounced creek type area there. Maybe there was a large hole that somebody had dug and had not mentioned it to David before. For whatever reason, the proper inclination would be to look at the ground, but they did not see anything there. It was unobstructed grass. It was as if he just disappeared right then and there, with no indication exactly of where he went to. And the whole family searched. His friends came over and they tried to search for him as well. The neighbors, not just the judge, but other neighbors came up and they tried to search too. They looked anywhere and everywhere for him, but they could not find him. Now, some of the research that I did says, and some people say this, others don't, but according to the tale, whenever this happened, they did hear, though, like a voice, a disembodied voice, like it was a voice muffled and not really screaming, but trying to catch their attention. And apparently, to those that heard it at that time, it might have been actually David Lang himself, again, trying to get the attention of somebody. Wherever he went to, wherever he disappeared to, he was there still, but they couldn't see him at that moment, but he was trying to catch his attention. And that's about the closest form of contact that anyone had with David at that time, at that particular time period when this happened. The way it was described was those that were in and around that area claimed to quote-unquote hear their father's voice echoing as if it was coming from another place. And the going theory associated to what happened to David was that, much like my previous video again where I was talking about the man from Taured, in this case David somehow lapsed into another dimension. And it could have been another dimension through a portal. It could have been another dimension through what did they call it, where a wormhole. It could have been where somebody grabbed him from the other dimension and pulled him through. But for whatever reason, David was there 1 minute and then the next he wasn't. So that's the story or the urban legend associated with David. There have been some updates with his experience as well. Shortly afterward, a couple of months after that disappearance, the children, now fatherless, again their names were George and Sarah, maybe they would go up to that spot again to try to see if they could find any remnants of anything indicating his disappearance. Well, they did find something. The story goes that after a couple of months, that very same spot that they saw their father vanish, that grass in and around that area had turned yellow and wilted. And there was also a circle measuring about 15 feet in diameter of that yellow wilted grass. And it was right there in that area where their father disappeared. No other parts of the grass elsewhere were turning that color or were wilting away, just right there in that area. And then as a second update, the way the story goes is you have to fast forward a good number of years, but later on, one of the children, now elderly at that point, said the way the story goes was one of the children, the youngest one, who's now about 30 years later, so it was a good number of years afterward, suddenly received a letter out of nowhere, but they completely recognized the handwriting associated with that letter, and it was from their father. And whatever this letter came from, and they only had one thing written in there, and it said, together now and forever, and then that was it. So again, 30 years later after this incident, one of his children, I believe it was the daughter Sarah, she received this letter. It was in her father's handwriting, and there was only one thing written on that letter, and it said together now and forever, and then that was it. So what was this particular tale, and how did it match what I was talking about earlier about the potential real life incidents that happened? And what I'm talking about is this. The way the story goes, again, this happened in 1880. Well, if you go back a little bit earlier to 1854, apparently there was a real life incident that actually could have inspired this legend of David Lang. And what I'm referring to is this. There was a book that was written in it was actually written in 1909, but it talks about an incident that occurred in 1854 about a man called Orion Williamson. This book was written by a gentleman that goes by the name of Ambrose Bierce, and you'll see a picture of him here. And he wrote this book. Again, the data that he wrote this book was 1909, but he talks about an incident that happened in 1854. So again, 1854 compared to 1880, it essentially previews it, or is preempted by about a good 30 years. And the incidents that he describes is as follows. And how this writer got knowledge of this incident is unknown. However, he did his research is unknown. But here's what he describes. He says that in 1854, July, in an area called Selma, Alabama, there was a planter there who went by the name of Orion Williamson. And this Orion Williamson also had a wife and had a child, and they had a plantation of sorts there with slaves. And just as it happened on this particular day, this guy Williamson was in and around his area, his farm, or in and around his house, and his child was nearby that area. And the way the story goes, this Williamson guy told this child that he's going to actually tend to his horses as well. And so the planter rose, the way the story goes is the planter rose saying, I forgot to tell Andrew about those horses. Andrew was their overseer, which is somebody who manages the plantation there. So this guy Williamson, after telling his son this, went across his field, and right at that very moment, there was a neighbor that was passing by, a gentleman by the name of Armour Wren, who had a son with him, and as he was passing by, he greeted him. The Armour Wren guy was also happening to be passing by in a buggy with a horse. Again, does all this sound familiar? It sure does, doesn't it? So the way the story goes, this guy Armour Wren was riding that buggy on his horse. He had his son. He acknowledged the Williamson guy that was passing by, and it was right at that moment that one of his horses suddenly started to buck. The way he became, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for, scared, or he became a little bit frightened for whatever reason, but the horse kind of bucked, which caught the attention of everybody except the son, because the son of that buggy rider at that moment suddenly said, "Why, father, what has become of Mr. Williamson?" And so when the father looked up, again, because he was distracted at what his horse was doing, when he looked up, suddenly this Williamson guy was gone, completely gone. I mean, he just disappeared right on the spot as well, also disappearing right in the middle of a field as well, again in front of this neighbor, although the story doesn't mention if the family members were witnessing this, but at least the son at that point was witnessing it, because he was the only one, and apparently this particular tale describes how this case actually went to court, and the son had to testify. He was apparently the only one that saw this, because he said that right before his eyes, this man, this Williamson guy, disappeared, and the manner that he disappeared was he was there one moment, and then that was it. He was gone the next. It's as if you were to remove somebody, cut and paste them directly from real life. You take a picture and there's a field there with someone, and then you cut and paste it and they're gone, and it was like that. It was that instantaneous. So that particular tale, doesn't it sound very, very familiar to the legend of David Lang? And if it does, it's because many others out there, and those who have done research into this particular urban legend, state that the urban legend associated with David Lang is nothing more than a hoax, or nothing more than a tall tale, a deviation of sorts associated with that book, The Difficulty of Crossing a Field, and a short story there associated with this guy Williamson. And it kind of makes sense because, again, the incidents associated with this guy Williamson happened almost 30 years before the incidents associated with David Lang. So one can easily see how David Lang was simply, the story associated with that, the urban legend associated with that, was simply following all of the information from this book, the one that happened, the incidents that happened with the Williamson guy. And again, the book was written in 1909, but it describes of that incidents happening in 1854. And so that's where people again surmise that the association with the urban legend of David Lang, nothing like that happened beforehand, only after the book was printed and then it was being written. Somebody apparently must have taken that incident with Williamson, and then it grew and added and changed, maybe changed the name, changed the location, added a couple of details here and there, and then that's where things changed and grew its own legs and became the urban legend that it is now. So pretty fascinating stuff. It doesn't even just end there. There have been tales, other writings with a writer, somebody that was in and around that area named Joe Mulhausen. He was, people say he was the one that actually created, as a fabrication, this urban legend, because he was simply a writer trying to sell a story, somebody who was trying to get money, somebody who was trying to find employment, and so he sold his story to the newspapers there, and that's where the urban legend started. So that's yet another angle that this particular urban legend comes from. So quite a myriad, isn't it? which one is the real tale? Is the urban legend of David Lang the real tale? Or is the incidents associated with this guy, Orion Williamson, that happened nearly 30 years earlier, that apparently David Lang's urban legend is based on, is that one the real tale? Or is it all just simply a fabrication from some writer, somebody named Joe Mulhatan, who was in and around that area in Tennessee, who was looking for some work, and he's the one that got everything else started with this urban legend because he was trying to make some money. Again, it's up to you to decide. I'm of the opinion that the incidents associated with Williamson is the one that's more real, and that the David Lang urban legend was just something that somebody wrote off of it, or something that somebody created off of that particular incident, because one came before the other, and the one that came before, I mean, that's the one that I tend to believe is more real, because the similarities are far, far too striking to consider otherwise. But if anyone agrees, please post your comments, share them below. If anyone has any other thoughts or opinions, it'd be interesting to hear those as well. So has anybody heard of this urban legend? Anybody heard any other variations, other surprises associated with it? It'll be interesting again to see what people have to say. So as always, your comments are welcome. So, alright, thanks again everybody. Take care.